Welcome, everyone. So, it's nice to be here again in Istanbul. I think I make a break of 2 years. And before that, I was more often in giving sessions here. But nevertheless, I'm really happy to be here again. And I want to talk about living on a green rocket field. So what's the meaning of that? The point is, in my company, we are normally working on the green fields. That means we're always ramping up the projects from zero. That's a luxury which not every developer has. With that, we have the possibility to look into new stuff with Google announces, and we can really work from the beginning with the alpha versions. A lot of these stuff can be sometimes problematic because they are alpha, but still we find some ways around it and hope for the next iterations of these libraries, they will create newer ones. So that's why I want to take a look what we as developers can today do better at Android development. I'm doing Android development more or less since 8 years. And it changed a lot. Every year, a lot of new stuff came in. And I personally think if you start as an Android developer today, it's easiest as an engineer to go into new areas. So let's at first look into the history. What's all about these libraries for Android developers? It started more or less with a support library in 2011, when they introduced they introduced Honeycomb, so the tablet version, and with fragments, so you don't have to always have activity for everything, because that's also problematic to have several activities on one screen. They introduced Honeycomb for the tablets, but unfortunately only if you support Honeycomb. With that idea came then up, okay, let's create something for the engineers that they can also use it for all the devices. That was the birth of the support libraries. Parallelly, Jake Wharton, I think most of you probably know him, created Action Bar Sherlock, which was a backward compatible implementation of the Action Bar, which was introduced as well with Honeycomb. Later on, 1 year later, they introduced new notifications and also created a notification compat. So you can create once just a notification, which then renders, depending on the system, the best suitable solution. There come more. And as you can see, 2013 was the first time Google themselves created an action bar support, which is called App Compat. Until then, a lot of people used already Action Bar Sherlock. So for a lot of engineers, there was no need to move immediately to the App Compat. But at that, slowly later, they stopped working on Action Bar Sherlock, and more or less all of the engineers moved as well to App Compat. 2013. At that time, they introduced material design for the engineers with card views and recycler views, and that was also compatible till API level 9, which was, let me lie, Gingerbread. A lot more libraries came up, and a lot of engineers face the problem that they reach the DEX limit, which means 65,000 methods. So Google decided to split their libraries because not every engineer needed all of these support libraries. That still wasn't enough. Even with ProGuard, which you activated at that time, you still reached the 65K limit because you used a lot of code. Then they introduced multidex. At first, it was just for KitKat, but you can also use it now since 2017 for all the devices as well. So what now? The king is dead, long live the king. And they introduced Jetpack. Jetpack is more or less nothing else than the support libraries. It just got a new label, and it's also a little bit more than just the support libraries. It's also, how I can say it in nice words, it's an opinionated framework of libraries which they tell you which you should use to ramp up your Android development. For example, one of these examples which is not from Google is, for example, retrofit. With that, you can easily do REST API calls and all that thing that's around HTTP calls. They also introduced at I/O the new package names for this new Android Jetpack. It's called Android X. They're going away from the old naming structure they have with Android support, and so on and so on. There's only one exception. It's the material design components which you can use. That has this com Google Android because it's really created from a different team and not directly from the Android team. How you can use it as an engineer? You just have to activate use Android X to true and enable Jettifier. Jettifier at that point goes through all the libraries that you have in your Gradle system and do bytecode manipulation from the old Android package names to the new ones. And if you think, for example, at one point you say, okay, every library we use doesn't use any old Android stuff. I just can disable Jettifier. That works. But you can't disable use Android X, especially if you use data binding and some other stuff which is generated by Android Studio, because depending on that flag, they use Android X or the old stuff. Jetpack consists mainly of 4 different pillars. One is the foundation, architecture, behavior, and UI. The foundation library, most of these things you know, it's app compat, multidex, and test. Test also, they introduced this year a new version, which is based on the project called Nitrogen, where you can now do, since the release of 4.0 of RoboElectric, you can use RoboElectric and Espresso. At the same time, you create once your test classes, and you can run it on both at the same time, so as a JVM level or as an Android emulator as well as a real device. Here new is the Android KTX. That is mainly the extension libraries for Kotlin. So Kotlin extensions. This is nothing new there. This is everything which you can still do with the old stuff, but it's a nicer way of using for Android engineers. You can split easily some stuff, like, for example, RGB colors. You can have, how was the name? The Decomposer, where you just split the RGB color namespace into 3 different values, or some other things like rectangles and these stuff. The base is core ATX, and everything is on top of that. The other pillar is architecture libraries. There are also a lot of what you know, like lifecycles that we announced 2 years ago, live data, room as well. But new came navigation, paging, and work manager. Now let's take a deeper look into the navigation at first, which we have currently the most experience in the project I'm working on. To use the navigation stuff is, or let's step back and look at what we had beforehand to do as an Android engineer. Most Android engineers created several activities for each screen, probably also fragments, and they have to do all the navigational backstack handlings themselves. Now they introduce navigation. With that, you don't have to do it manually anymore. They help you at that point to create something which you can make reusable and following the official guidelines how the workflow should work in Android. Therefore, you need the navigation controller. That's the main thing. Then they introduce a new resource type. It's called navigation. And you can easily define all your stuff in the navigation UI editor, which is called WYSIWYG. So what you see is what you get. Of course, you can still do it with the XML editor. And at that point, it's a little bit better than with the constraint layout editor. You don't create mess in the XML, which can be cumbersome to work later on. So let's think about, we have a list fragment as well as details fragment. You just define them. And then the navigation is also important. Let's think. You can see it here, the start destination. So for every graph, you have to define a start destination. So where your application starts. Then you can also see it then how you can use it is in a fragment. You have a fragment area. There you use the so-called Hasan Hos fragment that's also provided by Google. And you give them the navigation graph which you created beforehand. And this small thing, default Hasan Hos, is really important. When I created an example application for myself to see how that works for this presentation, I have forgotten this one line of this attribute. And then the point was, I was moving to the detail screen, press the back button, and the application closed. I said, what? Dig deep, analyze 2 or 3 hours in the night, and then say, okay, I just forgot one line. With that, it defines that everything which you do with your backstack, so up button or the back button, goes also through this navigation host fragment. With that, it handles automatically the backending for you. So that's the UI editor. It's quite simple. Here you see on which activity your Hasan Hos fragment is used. You see here the list of fragments you added already. For example, the list fragment as the details fragment. And with this one, can you see it? There. With this plus, you can add new fragments or create new fragments. How is it now? You can really use it already to navigate from one fragment to another one. But you don't see any visual indications that they can go from one fragment to another one. Therefore, they introduced also the actions. With the actions, you can define, I'm moving from the list fragment to the details. And if you do that, you get these nice errors. You can do that everything with XML, but as well, you can just drag and drop on the UI editor, and it does it automatically for you, all these generation of the code in the XML in the backend. And with this, you can really easily see how the application workflow is. If you, for example, talk with a designer or with a user experience person or with your product manager, they can see immediately how the program you have created there. Also, very important is the main idea of all this navigation framework is that you have single activity applications. It's not always working. If you, for example, look into the instant world apps, you have to have an own activity for the instant app. But nevertheless, the main idea is that you have one activity and everything in it. How we can use a navigation controller. At that point, the Kotlin extensions came in really nice here. You just can say on the view, find navigation controller, or you can do it directly in the fragment or activity. You can easily set on-click listeners. You don't have to create on-click listeners yourself. As well, they have set up with a nav controller for the important stuff like the toolbar, collect theme toolbar, bottom navigation view. That makes it real easy for us engineers. We just define a menu item with the ID of the navigation where we want to jump on from there. And everything else, the setup of the action bar or the drawer layout or the bottom navigation is handles for you. You just create the menu item, press on it, and it automatically opens the screen where you want to go, which you have defined in the menu. You say, well, that's not enough. I just don't have always just one fragment without any parameters. Therefore, they also created the arguments where you can define an archetype. Normally, it's on the UI, you normally can just do Boolean int, so the normal primitive types. But if you go to the XML, you can also easier introduce, you can use the parsables there as well, like you do in the activity and fragment arguments. How we can use it, you see at the bottom also again, a Kotlin extension is a bundle of. You just do the small hash maps there and give that as well as an argument, as an optional to your navigation. You say, yeah, that's nice. I want to go one way further because we are sick of the bundles that they are untyped. But before going there, let's see how they can use it. Or you can use it. You just apply a save args. That's a plugin for Android, for the Gradle plugin, which you have to set there. That creates automatically for you. Wrong direction. It just creates for you automatically a new class, which you can then use for the navigation or for the arguments. You have some type safetiness. At that point, you can see it here. Action to detail, that creates a bundle which you can use, and there you can set explicitly this session, and that's a string. For example, if you have a parameterized with parcelable, that's easier. You can really use just directly the code which you have created. It's type safe, and you don't have to think, okay, is this a string, is this an int, or whatever I have in that hash map. And to read it out again, you just go to the created class by the save args plugin, save from bundle, and just creates for you the object which you wanted to have at that point. You can also do deep linking with navigation graph. Therefore, you just have the fragment, add there the node deep link. You have to say which URL that is. You don't have to add the protocol because the protocol is generated automatically for you for the manifest. You can still use parameters like this one, the session ID. So that's an argument which you can extend. And the auto verify is a nice thing where you can say, for example, if let's think you have a website, you want to listen on the same link, press on it. Normally you get an application chooser to say, do you want to open the URL on a website, on a browser, or on your application. With the auto verifier, you have just to add one file to your server side, and that automatically opens your application. So you don't have to take care about the chooser. It's an easier understanding for the outside users of that. And you just have to add for the activity where your navigation host fragment is, this small thing. And with that, the whole deep link definition is done. It works. There's currently a bug in the alpha library of navigation. If you have nested graphs which you include, then this thing doesn't work. Hopefully they fix it in the upcoming weeks or months, till at least since we publish our application which we are working on. How we can use it? You just create from the nav controller a deep link, give the parameters, defines the destination. With that you get a pending intent you can create, and this pending intent you can use for the notification compat builder. Now you think, that's easy. That's normally what you think about a mono repo or a mono module, that you have a big module, but I want to go multi-module or to support features or dynamic libraries and all that stuff. How I can do that with the navigation library. They have also an idea how we can do that. Let's think about, we have the app module, we have 3 feature modules, and the base or the core of the application. On the base, you at first create the base navigation, which you can want to use everywhere. Then you create a main nav. And the nice thing of the resource systems is you can override it in higher levels of this application. That's why we have now here the main nav again. It has to be the same name, so we can override the resource itself and can also use the different feature sets. So how to use that? Like I said, you include the base navigation fragment and the base main navigation. There you define all the, for example, at this example from Lila, which, from DroidCon New York, where you explain how we can use instant app with a navigation component, with a navigation controller. You define the deep link, then you define your base navigation with the deep links. You have the feature A, where you do your own stuff, and then in the app, you just include every navigation sub-fragment. That should be all, so we can use it also in modules. Now, if you say, for example, also that you can use so-called conditional flows, like the login. You say, on some pages, I want to have the login, just do the login flow and go back. Currently, there's a bug on that point, that if you have create a nav graph from conditional, that you can't go back to the first one, because if they have so-called pop back stack, where you can say it should also include this, the destination which you has at that point, that unfortunately invalidates the whole navigation graph. That's why you can't go back and just crashes the app at that point. Hopefully they fix it as well in the near future. So that was mainly about the navigation which they introduced. Let's go to the next one, paging. A lot of engineers use the paging already. Everyone did it themselves. They created a scroll item listener in the recycler view and does the handling automatically, also which page when they have to reload. Therefore, they created a new library. You have to create a page list with the system. It's a data object, it's so heavily based on the live data. You create a data source where it just calls, and where the pages do the API calls later on, so the data source for this whole page list. And you have a page list adapter which you use in the recycler view. That's quite convenient. They also have some nice stuff there, like you can create placeholders. So, for example, like on Twitter or on Facebook, where you can say, even if your page you see there are some items, you can do it with the system as well. But I only recommend to use the placeholders if every view item which you use there have the same height. Otherwise, this looks ugly because it's working like an accordion. We faced the problem when I used it. I am creating a small chatish app that I wanted to be the owner of this list so I can manipulate that. Unfortunately, the paging library doesn't support you that you are the owner of the data. The data is handled in itself in the page list, so you have no direct access here. You can't manipulate the list. To 1 degree, that's a nice thing, because you don't have to take care about the paging stuff. But otherwise, if you want to reshuffle some stuff inside, then it's not working. But still, it's a nice thing. You don't have to fiddle around with other stuff. If you have a simple page, it really works easily. And they have also examples how we can use this with a network and database stuff. The other big thing they introduced was the work manager. Beforehand, you had to use the job scheduler, the job dispatcher, or the alarm manager, and have to take care yourself which one to use on which Android version. Therefore, they introduced the work manager. It's the success of it. You just use it, and that's doing all the background work for you. If you are now an engineer, and you're not just supporting Google devices, for example, I know Amazon, or you have some Chinese devices which you want to support which doesn't have Google Play services on top, you couldn't use something else than the job dispatcher. So even that was tied to the Play services. Now the work manager is completely free of Play services. You can use it standalone. And they take care of if they need a job scheduler, if they use a job dispatcher, or an alarm manager. You can also define constraints like in earlier days of the job scheduler and the job dispatcher. The alarm manager itself doesn't have any constraints. So constraints mean, for example, you want to do your batch work or your background work when the phone is charging or when it has a network. That's also introduced in the work manager. How you can use it? You just create a worker, it's called. In the worker, it's similar to an async task where you have do work where this is already on its own thread. You don't have to take care about the different threads at that point, that you are not running on the main thread. It's running definitely in a different thread. Also, you have to return 3 different values. One is success, one is failure or a retry, and retry says what it does, and failure is really a crash. And it returns some information to the creator of this worker. This little issue with that is if you have really a really long running task, you want to just do async, and you don't care, you just fire and forget. You don't get back the result. You say it's success, but in the end, it can still crash if you have a different task doing that. So with threading, you should be a bit cautious at that point. If you, for example, also use coroutines with that, try to avoid going asynchronous at that point. You are already in a different thread. Use blocking, run blocking at that point if you use coroutines. That's also the thing which they given as a hint how you can use with coroutines and the worker. These are here you can see how you can define constraints. There are a lot of more, and these you have just to put later on in the so-called one-time work request builder or the periodic one. These are 2 different. The one-time says everything, you just run it once. The other one, the periodic one, is where you can say it should be a recurring job every 12, 13, or once a day. You want to do the job again. The smallest time frame which you can there define is 15 minutes. For the longest one, it's really unimportant, but why you should go much more than 1 or 2 days, it depends on the use case, of course. Also, the point is, if you use the periodic one, it just starts. If you say now periodic for 12 hours, it doesn't start now. It starts earliest in 12 hours. So that's a bit mindset shift to the old job scheduler because that started immediately. So you probably have to use that first a one-time runner and then in 12 hours again with the periodic one. You can also chain these workers if you have different jobs where you say, for example, you want to have that A and B runs one after another, and parallel you say C and D should run, and only E should run if all the others run as well. This you can do with the chains, for the continuations. You can also have the possibility to give working results from one worker to the next one. They are really just concentrating on primitive types. Possibly you currently can't use that because these workers also survive, for example, a phone restart where you don't have to take care of. That's why they're really just focusing on the primitives for having that safe at that point. The third pillar is the behavior libraries. I think most of them know you. Only slices is completely new. They introduced them. It's more or less the home widget, but only the difference you can run it in other applications. For example, also in the search, you can create your own slice for your application, define it, you can also test it, and it will be used as well in the search if you use the actions from Google. They are only supported starting from a API level 19, which is KitKat. I'm not if that's true still, but currently they are only not visible for the end users. There are probably some areas where they test it currently, but you can still be first movers in the slicing areas. In the UI libraries, the fourth pillar, there's really nothing new. It's the old stuff. You can still use it. There's a so-called Sunflower application by Google that's a Jetpack sample application where you see the users of all the Jetpack libraries in one place. Because normally in the demo applications area, you have just one area which they focus on or the other, but not a complete one which shows all the different use cases. Of course, it's not a really big, complex one, but for the easiness, you can see a complete example of an application and not just one activity with one screen, which doing everything on this activity more or less. So while developing always on a green field, we see always problems with SDKs from or libraries from other engineers on GitHub or whatever. And my wish would be for the SDK engineers or the library creators, don't force your users to any marshaller. Marshaller is, for example, you have a JSON marshaller, can be JSON, Jackson, or Moshi. Don't say, well, the market currently state of the art is JSON. To one degree, we are true. But the point is, engineers also develop themselves. They evolve. They go into new directions. Try to create something like Ritter would have done with the calling adapters. No, with the converter factories, where you can define, I want to use Moshi, JSON, or Jackson. I had once a library which I discussed with the owner of the library. It was really just a string of 100 characters. Also, that was a JSON. He said, well, we want to parse that. I said, fine, just do it. Yeah, he introduced JSON for that. So JSON is not the smallest library. It has a lot of k-eats, and it do also reflection. At that point, that mocked me, because we currently just use Moshi, for example. And now I have my application Moshi and JSON as well at the same time. That's not the nicest experience for an engineer. That's why if you do something like that, try to create a level or create different implementations you can do. For example, the Moshi or JSON is easily do, also Jackson, if you don't have a big domain object which you define for your stuff. Also, don't force your users to use Rx. I know it's a cool thing. It was 2 years, this hype. I personally didn't get into Rx. I don't like it also, of this whole system. Because most engineers just used it for the threading part. And nowadays, there's a cooler boy, I would say, like coroutines which you can use. It's easier to use, you understand it better, and it's easier to read. Try use that, but still, if you have a library which heavily works on Rx, it's not nice for your engineers, for the developers who want to use your library. Also, I had once where I wanted to use a license screen in a really old company where I worked for. And there we wanted to use a different library, which just does everything automatically for us. The library itself was quite small. It was just 10K or 50K. But it had a dependency with Gradle, which brings in another half megabyte. It's not nice that you bloat the application of your users if you are just focusing on a small use case. Try to make it transparent. Let the users decide. Don't depend so much on libraries, even if others use them regularly. And most importantly, offer your engineers or the developers of your library, which is your customers at that point, a Prograd config. Rather over the jar or AR, the jar also works now with R8. And don't create a Prograd config which just opens the gate for every class. Concentrate on your stuff and make it as small as possible that the people can really benefit from our Prograd configuration. And that's more or less. Any questions? You can also find the slides on speaker deck. I think I also tutoring them. If you don't want to take any picture of before you forget it, they are online. You can always ask me questions afterwards. Are there any questions? No? Okay. Then thank you very much. You can still come later on if you have any questions. Enjoy Devfest.